Let's talk next about drawing the forms of the hands. Now, contrary to popular belief, hands are not that hard to draw when they're in basic poses. When you're starting to do more complex poses with the hands, things do get a little bit tricky, but the forms themselves are fairly basic and usually you can work it out without reference. So, much like the other forms, we start with a basic set of forms. This would be our palm, just a block. And for the fingers, we'll use cylinder shapes. Just as we've done before though, these types of basic 3D forms are not good enough for us. Why? Because they're static. And so we're going to basically do what we do and bend them, at least bend them in a way that is very similar to the way the actual anatomy bends to some extent. So for example, we'll start drawing our palms like this now, where we're bending the sides. We have a smaller plane at the bottom and a larger plane at the top. This is where the fingers connect. And we'll need a decent amount of equal spacing or markers to know where to put those 4 fingers. Then using our proportional guide, we can also mark just a circle or some kind of marker to help us know where to place the thumb. And then as for the fingers, they really follow the opposing curves kind of rule, where we're using cylinders that we're bending and bending them in a way that makes sense, where the curves oppose. So we have the curve going that way, that curve going that way, and then the final curve going that way. And that is how we can get our finger shapes going. Just as an anatomical note, the fingers generally have 3 parts. I say generally, depends what you're drawing. You might be drawing a crazy alien or something like that. But as for human anatomy, the fingers have 3 parts. It's definitely something you want to always keep in mind. It can be very easy to make them 2 or even sometimes 1 part. The thumb tends to have, the thumb does in fact have 3, but because one of the joints is on this area over here, built into the palm in a sense, sometimes you don't illustrate it so obviously that it's the first part of the 3. So let's draw some hands using these forms, these dynamic cylinders and this dynamic palm shape, using what we know of our proportional guide, that the middle finger should be as long as the palm, that the ring finger and the index finger are roughly the same height as one another, slightly shorter than the middle finger, and that we place the thumb just below the halfway line of the palm's halfway line. Right, and we're going to use opposing curves theory to help us get these elements out. So first off, let's just do a basic 3/4 angle hand structure, and we'll bend those sides with that basic form. Can just mark our finger locations, put our thumb there. I usually draw effectively a sphere here, but it doesn't jut out fully like a sphere. It's almost like a half sphere jutting out. And I know that I want to attach my thumb there, probably somewhere there. And the fingers generally oppose first at this angle from the palm before they move on to the other oppositions. So that's useful to know. So if this were a side view of the hand usually will be moving up like that, then the knuckle, and then the fingers moving out at that angle. Maybe that looks a little abstract, but nevertheless. So here we can insert these base ellipses and make our shapes, our bent and dynamic cylinders, kind of sizing them as much as we can to the size of the fingers, the size that the fingers should be. So here's the middle finger. I want to measure that length out nicely, make sure the middle finger doesn't get too long. It's actually already too long in that joint. This one is already too long as well. Let's just adjust that. Pinky's one, second one is actually around there. And then ending off the shapes with these small opposing curved cylinder shapes. So I'm being very rough with this. But that's fine because it's the structure, it's very important. Draw clear, don't draw clean. Let's get a lot of clarity in there. Alright, and maybe this edge of this palm extends a little too far out. Just adjust that shape a little bit. And similarly with the thumb, it has 3 parts. The first part's sort of being here, this being the second, and here's the third. And in fact and indeed, the palm, while we certainly do bend this side of the palm, as we're bending these front sections of it, the side view of the palm is not completely straight either. We want to have a bend of sorts based on the pose of the hand, that the palm's block, if you want to call it that, or the block of the palm, or the basic form of the palm, is bending in some way based on the pose. So here, it's not illustrated well in that regard, but we want to have that bend, that it's clear that the side of the palm is also bending. Right. And I'm going to lighten this just as we put the skin layer on here. Excuse me. And we can then use these forms to inform the skin layer. You can see I'm just doing it very loosely here. The great thing about hands in general is that most people have them, and so most people have a reference right in front of them if you do find that you're struggling to draw the hands. Just really following those form lines. And adding just a very basic skin layer to those forms. Now, the beauty of understanding the basic forms that we're adding dynamism to, so that we're drawing with dynamic forms, the beauty of understanding the basic forms is that we can rotate these simple shapes much more easily than trying to rotate complex skin layered, muscle layered hands. It's very complicated, and it's even overwhelming to try and think about how am I going to rotate in space something so complex as a hand. But when you're only dealing with these curved cylinders and a palm that you're just really bending a block at different angles, it becomes a lot easier to imagine the other sides of these objects. For example, if the hand were facing us, we might draw something like this. As it recedes, these are the areas for the fingers. maybe the thumb ball starts here, still following our proportions. If we were drawing a hand, the back of a hand, for example, it's really just the same as the front. We're just not going to see all the same details that we'd see in the palm, etc. And you may see me, especially in the demos that we're going to be looking at, doing the hands, especially when we're doing big drawings, doing the hands in a way where I will mainly just place down one form, like this, and then indicate the fingers in whatever pose the fingers are doing. And you can certainly do that and just really make sure that the proportions are matching. Because when it comes time to getting in those final lines, not for the finished piece, but for the final rough, you can then add the forms and take your time in really getting the hand to look how you want to. And bending the fingers similarly is simply a matter of placing the tubular forms at different points of rotation and different points of pivot from one another, keeping in mind the opposing curves rule. So this finger is kind of bending in a very awkward way. But certainly a possible finger pose, if a little bit exaggerated. Perhaps the fingers pressing on a table or some solid surface. So in a nutshell, these are the basic forms of the hand. And I would definitely encourage you, of course you do have assignments regarding this, but I definitely encourage you even now, give it a try. Give it a try and see how successful you really can be with just these basic forms and following the rules of opposing curves. If one thing curves the one way, the other thing will curve the other, applying throughout anatomy. That's the end of this lesson.